Imagine this. It's late at night. You're tired from a long day, your feet hurt, the kids are finally asleep, and you just want 5 minutes of peace. You flip on the television and there he is, that perfectly combed hair, that sharp pencil tapping on the desk, that slow sideways smile that told you something incredible was about to happen. Johnny Carson. The king of late night. The man who didn't just host a talk show, he created an institution. And tonight, we are going back to where comedy was king, where legends walked out from behind a curtain and nothing, absolutely nothing, was scripted the way it actually turned out. This is the most funny jokes on Johnny Carson, Part 3, and I promise you, if you've had a bad day, a bad week, or honestly just a bad year, the next several minutes are going to fix all of that. Stay right here. Don't you dare click away, because what happens in the middle of this video is genuinely one of the most jaw-dropping moments in the history of live television. Let's start with a name that makes every comedy fan sit up a little straighter in their seat. Don Rickles. Now if you've never seen Don Rickles in action, let me paint you a picture. Imagine someone handed a grenade to a comedian, told him the pin was already out, and then just pointed him at the most famous people in the world and said, "Go ahead." That is Don Rickles on The Tonight Show with Johnny Carson. The man walked in like he owned the building, sat down next to Johnny like he was doing Johnny a favor, and then proceeded to absolutely destroy everyone in the room including himself. The beauty of Rickles was that he never picked on people he didn't genuinely respect. Every single insult was a love letter written in fire. When he sat across from Johnny on May 31st, 1991, and looked him dead in the eyes and said, "Johnny, you know what I love about you? When I call you, your wife answers and I hang up," the entire studio erupted. Johnny tried to keep a straight face. He lasted about 2 seconds. That was the magic of Don Rickles. He could make the most controlled man on television completely fall apart just by opening his mouth. But here's what people forget about Rickles. It wasn't just the insults. It was the timing. Every great comedian understands that comedy is not about what you say, it's about when you say it, how long you hold the silence before you say it, and whether you blink while you're saying it. Don Rickles never blinked. He'd lock eyes with you like a fighter before a title bout and then hit you with something so absurd, so personal, so perfectly aimed that the only response was helpless laughter. Johnny Carson once described Rickles as the only guest who scared him. Not because Rickles was mean, but because Johnny genuinely never knew what was coming next. And that uncertainty, that electric unpredictability, is exactly what made every single Rickles appearance one for the history books. There is a moment in January 1977, look it up right now if you haven't seen it, where Rickles roasted literally every single person sitting on Carson's couch in a single uninterrupted 4-minute run of comedy that left the entire audience breathless. People in the back row were crying. Not sad tears. The kind of tears that happen when your body just physically cannot contain the laughter anymore. Now let's talk about the first time Robin Williams walked out onto that stage. Because this moment is genuinely one of those things where you could study it for the rest of your life and still not fully understand how one human being can operate at that frequency. It was the late 1970s. Robin Williams was not yet the star he would become. He was young, slightly wild-eyed, and absolutely overflowing with an energy that seemed to be coming from some other dimension entirely. Johnny introduced him. Robin sat down. And within about 30 seconds, everything that Johnny had planned for that segment simply ceased to exist. Robin Williams didn't do an interview. He performed a one-man show about everything and nothing simultaneously. He switched accents mid-sentence. He invented characters while talking about other characters. He made references that looped back on themselves and somehow still made perfect sense. Johnny Carson, one of the most seasoned performers in the history of American television, sat back in his chair with the expression of a man watching something he had absolutely no framework to describe. His pencil stopped tapping. His smile stopped being the measured, professional smile and became something completely genuine and a little bit helpless. The audience wasn't just laughing, they were screaming. And by the time Robin Williams finally paused to take a breath, Johnny Carson turned to the camera and said, "Without a script, without a note card, I have no idea what just happened, but I think I need a drink." The crowd went wild. Because in that moment, the most unflappable man in television had been genuinely, completely, beautifully unflappable. Robin Williams appeared on The Tonight Show multiple times over the years, and every single appearance had that same quality, the feeling that you were watching something that could not possibly be rehearsed, could not possibly be controlled, and could not possibly be anything less than absolutely electric. Now I want to take you somewhere unexpected. I want to take you to a conversation about duck hunting. Yes, duck hunting. Because Buddy Hackett had a way of turning the most ordinary, mundane, innocent topics into comedy that was so layered, so perfectly constructed, and so somehow simultaneously innocent and completely out of pocket that you'd be laughing for 3 full minutes before you even processed what you'd just heard. Buddy Hackett was a legend on The Tonight Show. He had that round, happy face and those big bright eyes that made him look like the world's friendliest person. And then he opened his mouth and something magical happened. The year was 1983. Buddy sat down next to Johnny, got comfortable, and began telling a story about going duck hunting with a friend. The story started completely normal. There were ducks. There was a lake. There were 2 men in a boat at 5 o'clock in the morning. And then, with the kind of slow, careful construction that only a true master of comedy can execute, Buddy Hackett began adding details. Small details at first. Then bigger ones. Then one detail that absolutely nobody in that studio expected. Johnny Carson, who had seen literally everything in 30 years of television, put his hand over his mouth. His shoulders shook. He tried to compose himself. He failed magnificently. The camera caught a close-up of Johnny's face just as the final punchline landed, and you can see the exact moment his professionalism completely abandoned him. His head went back, his laugh was completely silent for about 3 seconds the way really big laughs always are, and then the whole room exploded. Ed McMahon, sitting just off to the side, was already gone. Ed was always the first to go. Bless him. Buddy Hackett bowed, Johnny wiped his eyes, and somewhere in America, millions of people watching at home were having the exact same reaction as that studio audience, completely, joyfully, helplessly lost. Speaking of Ed McMahon, and we absolutely have to speak of Ed McMahon, because this man is underappreciated in the history of comedy. Ed was Johnny's announcer, his sidekick, his straight man, and his best friend on television for 30 years. But Ed McMahon was funny on his own terms and in his own right. There was a particular evening in 1977 that has become one of the most talked about moments in Tonight Show history. Ed McMahon had attended a lunch earlier that afternoon. Let's just say the lunch involved considerably more liquid refreshment than solid food. By the time the cameras rolled that evening, Ed was, how do we say this diplomatically, operating at a slightly elevated level of goodwill toward all mankind. He was not falling down drunk. He was that specific and very specific level of drunk that makes a person feel absolutely certain they are performing perfectly while everyone around them can clearly observe otherwise. Ed sat in his usual spot. He did his usual introduction. And then he attempted to read some copy from a cue card, and something in the translation from cue card to spoken English went gently but undeniably sideways. Johnny Carson noticed immediately. The way Johnny glanced sideways at Ed was the look of a man who has worked with someone long enough to know exactly what is happening without needing any additional information. And rather than throwing Ed under the bus, which would have been the easy thing to do, Johnny Carson did what only Johnny Carson could do. He let the moment breathe, gave Ed all the rope he needed, and then with one perfectly placed, completely deadpan line, made the whole thing funnier than any scripted bit could ever have been. Ed, to his eternal credit, laughed harder than anyone. Because that was the relationship those 2 men had. It was real. It was warm. And even when it was chaotic, it was always funny. Joan Rivers. Let's talk about Joan Rivers. There are people in comedy who are funny. And then there are people in comedy who are dangerous, who have that quality of absolute fearlessness that makes you lean forward in your seat because you genuinely cannot predict what they're about to say. Joan Rivers was the second kind of person, and every appearance on The Tonight Show was proof of it. In 1974, Joan sat down across from Johnny with that huge smile and those enormous eyes, and within minutes was in the middle of a joke about the army that had the audience in complete chaos. Joan Rivers had this extraordinary ability to talk about things that were not supposed to be talked about in polite company and make you not just accept it but genuinely celebrate it. Johnny Carson had complicated feelings about Joan Rivers, that much is documented and known, but on camera, in those electric, crackling Tonight Show moments, you could see genuine admiration in his eyes. Because Johnny Carson, whatever his personal feelings about women in comedy at the time, recognized talent the way a physicist recognizes a natural law. It was just obvious. It was undeniable. Joan Rivers was undeniable. When she told that army joke in 1974, Johnny leaned back with that signature slow head tilt that meant he was genuinely surprised, which from Johnny Carson was the highest possible compliment. The audience was so loud that the director had to cut away just to let it settle. Joan sat there with a completely straight face, hands folded in her lap, like someone who had just said absolutely nothing unusual. That contrast, that serene calmness in the middle of controlled chaos, was pure comedy genius. Now here is where we pause for 1 second and appreciate something that people often miss about The Tonight Show. It wasn't just the jokes. It wasn't just the famous people. It was the way the whole thing was constructed, this perfectly balanced machine of comedy and conversation and unpredictability, all held together by one man who had an almost supernatural ability to listen. Johnny Carson was the greatest listener in the history of television. Most talk show hosts are thinking about their next question while the guest is still answering the last one. Johnny Carson actually heard you. He absorbed what you said, he considered it for a beat, and then he responded in a way that either built on it perfectly or turned it in a direction nobody expected. That ability to listen is what allowed him to take every unexpected moment, and there were hundreds of them, and turn it into comedy gold rather than awkward silence. It's what made The Tonight Show the kind of television you didn't just watch. You experienced it. Rodney Dangerfield. Oh, Rodney Dangerfield. The man who got no respect and made a career out of it. When Rodney walked out onto that stage, you knew exactly what you were getting, and somehow it was still always a surprise. In 1982 and 1983, Rodney Dangerfield had what many people consider the greatest run of consecutive Tonight Show performances in the show's history. Every single time he sat down across from Johnny, he delivered a machine gun barrage of one-liners so precisely constructed and so perfectly timed that the audience never had time to recover from one before the next one hit. My wife and I have a great relationship. She gives me the silent treatment, and I pretend to listen. Pause. My doctor told me I need to watch my drinking. Now I drink in front of a mirror. Pause. I asked my wife if she'd like a diamond for her anniversary. She said she wanted something to make her look young and beautiful. I gave her a mirror. Pause. She said give it back. The audience at that point was in complete physical distress from laughing. People were holding their sides. Women in the front row were fanning themselves. And through all of it, Rodney sat there with that loosened tie and that sweating forehead and those wide, permanently alarmed eyes, like a man who had just received very bad news that he was somehow contractual obligated to turn into comedy. Johnny Carson loved Rodney Dangerfield. You could see it in the way Johnny watched him, not the professional appreciation of a host watching a guest perform well, but the genuine, uncomplicated delight of a man watching someone do something extraordinary. And then there was Betty White. Betty White on The Tonight Show was something that existed in its own special category. She was elegant and warm and charming and then, without warning, would say something so sharp it took the air out of the room. In 1978, Betty White appeared in one of the most famous sketches in Tonight Show history, the female reporter in the locker room sketch. The premise was simple. Betty White played a sports reporter who had to enter a professional sports locker room to conduct interviews. The situations that followed were exactly what you'd expect, except filtered through Betty White's particular genius, which meant they were somehow both completely inappropriate and completely delightful at the same time. Johnny Carson, who played a somewhat bewildered sports executive in the sketch, could barely keep a straight face through the entire thing. Every time Betty White delivered a line, that clean, precise, perfectly innocent delivery over content that was absolutely not innocent, Johnny's composure cracked a little more. By the end of the sketch, he had basically given up pretending he wasn't laughing and was simply standing there in the scene, grinning helplessly, which made the audience laugh even harder because when Johnny Carson breaks character, it means something extraordinary just happened. Jonathan Winters deserves his own entire documentary, but let's spend a moment with him here because no story about the funniest moments on The Tonight Show is complete without acknowledging what Jonathan Winters brought to that couch. Jonathan Winters was an improvisational genius in the purest possible sense of the word. He didn't do prepared material in the way other comedians did. He walked onto a stage with a single idea, sometimes just a single object, and built an entire universe around it in real time. He could look at a simple wooden chair and within 60 seconds create 4 different characters, 3 different situations, and a punchline that tied all of it together in a way that felt simultaneously completely impossible and completely inevitable. When Jonathan Winters and Robin Williams appeared on The Tonight Show together, 2 improvisational giants sharing the same couch, it was like watching 2 jazz musicians who had never played together somehow create something that sounded like it had been rehearsed for years. Johnny Carson sat between them or beside them and did the only thing you can do in that situation. He got out of their way and enjoyed the ride. There were moments in those joint appearances where even Johnny Carson forgot he was hosting a television show and just became an audience member. And those moments are among the most beautiful things ever captured on American television. Let's talk about Frank Sinatra. Because one of the most legendary moments in Tonight Show history involved Frank Sinatra, and the beautiful thing about it is that Frank Sinatra was not even supposed to be there. Don Rickles was appearing on the show one evening. Johnny Carson was hosting. Everything was going exactly as planned, which on a night with Don Rickles always meant it wasn't going as planned at all. And then Don Rickles, mid-monologue, mid-insult, mid-everything, made a comment about Frank Sinatra that was, well, it was the kind of comment that you can only make about Frank Sinatra if you are either completely fearless or completely mad or have the kind of relationship with Frank Sinatra that Don Rickles had. The audience held its collective breath for a moment. And then from somewhere in the wings, or according to some accounts, from the audience itself, there was a reaction that sent the whole studio into absolute pandemonium. Johnny Carson's face in that moment is worth studying. It's the face of a man who is simultaneously a professional broadcaster and a genuinely astonished human being, and he can't fully be either one because both halves of him are too busy laughing. Here is something that people who have only seen clips of The Tonight Show don't fully appreciate. The relationship between Johnny Carson and his studio audience was unlike anything else on television. Other shows had audiences that watched and reacted. Johnny Carson's audience was a participant in the show. When Johnny told a monologue joke that didn't quite land, and sometimes they didn't, because 30 years of television means thousands of jokes and not every single one is gold, Johnny would do something that no other host of that era did. He would acknowledge it. He would turn to the audience with that slow, slightly pained smile and say something like, "That was a rough one," or he'd mind playing golf, and the audience would laugh harder at his recovery than they would have laughed at the joke. That self-awareness, that honesty, that refusal to pretend the emperor's clothes were magnificent when they weren't, that was what made people trust Johnny Carson. And trust, in comedy and in television, is everything. Jack Lemmon came onto the show more than once, and every single time it was a masterclass in how genuine warmth and genuine wit look when they live in the same person. Jack Lemmon off the big screen, sitting in the casual setting of The Tonight Show, was not the polished movie star performing for cameras. He was a funny, self-deprecating, genuinely delightful human being who loved to tell stories and loved to laugh at himself, which is the specific combination that makes for extraordinary talk show television. There was one evening when Jack Lemmon and Walter Matthau, who had appeared together in some of the greatest comedic films in Hollywood history, appeared on The Tonight Show together, and the chemistry between them was so natural, so lived in, so real that it felt less like watching a television show and more like accidentally overhearing 2 old friends at a restaurant. They disagreed about everything, they teased each other constantly, and underneath all of it was an affection so obvious it was almost uncomfortable to witness, the way real intimacy always is when you see it in public. Johnny Carson watched them with the expression of someone who has arranged a dinner party that turned out even better than they planned. And now here is the moment I promised you at the beginning. The moment that lives in the all-time Hall of Fame of live television moments. Ed Ames. If you know, you know. If you don't know, prepare yourself. Ed Ames was a singer, an actor, a serious performer. He had appeared on The Tonight Show to demonstrate his skills as a Native American. He had played one on a television drama, and specifically to demonstrate tomahawk throwing, which he had learned for the role. Johnny Carson set up a wooden figure of a human silhouette as the target. Ed Ames stood at the designated distance. He wound up. He threw the tomahawk with complete confidence and professional precision. And the tomahawk landed, in absolutely perfect detail, in the exact anatomical location that you do not expect a tomahawk to land on a wooden figure of a person during a television broadcast. The audience reaction began as pure shock. Then it became the longest sustained laugh in Tonight Show history, a laugh so overwhelming, so total, so genuinely uncontrollable that it lasted for 30 full seconds. Johnny Carson, to his eternal credit, waited for the audience to settle, and then, with perfect composure and perfect timing, looked at the tomahawk, looked at the audience, and said, "I didn't even know you were Jewish." The studio exploded again. Ed Ames laughed until he had tears on his face. Johnny laughed until he leaned forward onto his desk. Ed McMahon was completely gone. And somewhere, the director of The Tonight Show was watching his monitors thinking, "This is the kind of television that only happens once, and we are watching it right now, live, unrepeatable, perfect." That is the secret of Johnny Carson. That is the thing that all the clips and all the highlights and all the compilations try to capture but only partially succeed in capturing. It wasn't the jokes, although the jokes were extraordinary. It wasn't the guests, although the guests were legends. It wasn't the set or the band or Ed McMahon's enormous, cathedral-filling laugh. It was Johnny Carson himself. It was the specific way he inhabited that chair, that desk, that stage, for 30 years. The way he could be simultaneously the most controlled person in the room and the most spontaneous. The way he made every single person who sat across from him feel like the most interesting person who had ever lived. The way he laughed, that real, genuine, sometimes silent, sometimes explosive laugh that you only get from a man who truly loves what he's doing and truly appreciates what is being given. Johnny Carson turned comedy into communion. He turned a television studio into a living room. He turned strangers into friends and celebrities into human beings. And he did it every single night, in front of millions of people, without a net, without a safety mechanism, without anything to fall back on except his own extraordinary talent and 30 years of earned brilliance. The Tonight Show ended on May 22, 1992. 30 years. Almost 7,000 episodes. Thousands of guests. Millions of jokes. One man at the center of all of it. Johnny Carson said goodbye in a way that was so understated, so entirely in keeping with who he was, that people who watched it still describe it as one of the most moving moments in television history. He didn't make it a spectacle. He didn't bring out a parade of famous friends. He sat in his chair, he talked to the audience like a man talking to old friends at the end of a very long, very good evening, and he said thank you. Just thank you. And then the curtain came down on the longest, greatest, funniest, warmest run in the history of American television. Every time you watch a clip of The Tonight Show, you're not just watching comedy. You're watching a man doing exactly what he was meant to do, in exactly the place he was meant to do it, with exactly the people who were worthy of sharing that stage. Don Rickles, Robin Williams, Buddy Hackett, Joan Rivers, Rodney Dangerfield, Betty White, Jonathan Winters, Ed McMahon, Ed Ames, Jack Lemmon, Walter Matthau, Frank Sinatra. These were not just guests on a talk show. They were collaborators in something that has never been replicated and will probably never be replicated. Because what made The Tonight Show with Johnny Carson what it was had almost nothing to do with the format and almost everything to do with the man. The man is gone now. But the tape is still there. The laughter is still there. And as long as it is, we will keep coming back to it. Because some things do not age. Some things do not diminish. Some things simply remain, permanently, perfectly, joyfully funny. No matter how many years pass, no matter how many times you've seen them, no matter how old you get. Johnny Carson is one of those things. The Tonight Show is one of those things. And if you haven't already gone to subscribe to this channel and hit the notification bell, do it right now. Because we are just getting started, and part 4 is going to be even better than this. Thank you for watching. Stay funny. Stay curious. And never stop laughing.